Welcome to YIMBY Nation, a podcast exploring U.S. housing and the roadblocks to building more equitable neighborhoods. Join Jimmy, Peter, and V as they, and special guests, offer their unique perspectives on building more diverse communities and addressing the social problems that emanate from the lack of decent, safe, and affordable housing. Our hosts have served in the fields of advocacy and nonprofit, public, and private development, and are driven by their passion for community empowerment. Join the conversation and share your thoughts on social using hashtag YIMBYNation.
Gregory Russ was appointed chair and CEO of the New York City Housing Authority in 2019. Greg is a seasoned housing professional with decades of management experience. He's helped to rebuild and strengthen public housing authorities across the country, including in Detroit, Philadelphia, and Chicago. In a career that spans decades, Greg most recently served as executive director and CEO of the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority and as executive director of the Cambridge Housing Authority, where he spearheaded sweeping plans to deliver extensive apartment renovations across the entire housing portfolio. Greg holds a bachelor's degree in English from Shippensburg State University of Pennsylvania and is a board member of the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities. He is also a former president of the Public Housing Authority Directors Association.
Welcome, Greg. Chair Ross. My name is Vicentia Dusay. With me are my co-hosts, Jimmy Miller and Peter Wood. And we are the co-hosts of the newly podcast, YIMBY Nation. We are very excited and thrilled to have you join us today. You were appointed to serve as the chairman and CEO of NYCHA in August 12, 2019. Talk to us about your pathway to coming to NYCHA and your experience over the past 28 months.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me this morning, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about NYCHA. One thing that I should ask everyone to think about is that the establishment of this position with me in it is actually part of the process that came out of the January HUD agreement that was signed with HUD in the Southern District in the city, because even though the city identified the chair, I was actually interviewed by the Southern District of New York and HUD and screened through that whole process. So it's a little bit different than I think prior appointments, because the city initiated, but we now had to get agreement among the parties here that this actually could be a good fit. And that sort of also speaks to the new role of this position under the HUD agreement, which is you have stakeholders who've signed on the dotted line. The city, the Southern District of New York, HUD itself, and us are all signatories to the agreement. And that agreement is part of what we're doing. That agreement is like a piece of the foundation about what NYCHA needs to do. To be honest, I mean, my path to getting here started in 1973, and at the very first housing authority I ever worked for, and has continued. This was kind of an unexpected turn, but it's been a long time working in housing authorities all over the country. And that helps you reflect on what we have in New York. And what we have in New York are two things. We have the institutional structure, which isn't serving the families the way it needs to serve. And we have a housing stock that is severely undercapitalized, far beyond what I think folks are willing to admit to. If we had managed real estate in a more conventional setting, we're 60 years behind in capital investment. I don't know how else to describe it. We've missed 3 cycles of reinvestment into the properties. That's one of the reasons that the RAD and PACT deals are exciting, because they're beginning to restore some of that. but that also accounts for these huge capital numbers. And that drives conditions and dissatisfaction. That drives repair costs and high maintenance costs. And that, when it's coupled with the institutional reforms that are required, really puts NYCHA in a place all by itself. And I'd say in the 28 months since I've gotten here, these are not good conditions for people to live in. I haven't seen conditions like this at housing authorities in a long time. And we have to solve those twin problems: reform the organization, invest in the property. And lastly, if we get the opportunity with the property investment, invest in the people. So that's a quick kind of path and assessment. But it really is something to see at this scale.
Thank you, Russ. And I think you answered my follow-up question in some ways, but that new road, that path to get in here, how do you manage to combine these two overwhelming significant positions?
We're required to make NYCHA different under the HUD agreement. I kind of see this job as the chair reflects on the board and the policy. The CEO, in combination with the COO, is reflecting on the work that has to be done from top down, bottom up. And part of it is refocusing NYCHA's lens. It's easy, because we're so big, to hover high above and look down. It's kind of like, okay, here's a policy for the entire organization. And maybe it's a really good policy, The harder thing is to go to the property and look up and say, okay, what are the things here when I'm on site that do not work for the property, and then consequently do not work for the residents? So this property focus, which is sort of the core of a real estate principle, to me has been diluted by NYCHA's capital problem, and also our tendency as a large institution to think about us in the whole of it, the whole cloth, when in fact we have to take little pieces of it, because each one of those properties is different. Each one of those properties has a unique resident profile, or is in a neighborhood that's unique. And pushing NYCHA to get down to that level is what these reforms are about. It's reinstituting, if you will, the idea that, property management is about the property first. And then if you can start to get that right, you pull down what you need from the larger organization to begin to support that effort. And that's kind of the direction we've developed with the transformation plan, which is our reorganizational document that the Southern District and HUD concurred in this past March. When you add that plus the capital, it equals hope.
So I was at NYCHA from 1990 to 2000. I had the opportunity to serve as the director of planning and also as a deputy general manager for asset management and private market operations. And I've always, first of all, you talk about capital need. You have about $32 billion of capital need, which I think is just, a number that I can't comprehend. But when I was at NYCHA, I was always concerned about NYCHA's long-term viability. I'm also concerned about the viability of public housing in general. I just always have questioned whether or not public housing, as we know it, is a sustainable way of providing housing. And give me your take on just the broader picture of public housing. Can it be sustained? Can New York City's public housing portfolio be sustained?
That's sure. No, first of all, that's a good question, because it reflects back on the creation of the program itself. If we think about the 37 Housing Act, it created a mechanism to build public housing. It created a mechanism to pay for the capital. It created the notion that you have public housing as a way station, that there's a path through it that you would graduate out, and that the incomes from the rents would support the property. And by 1957, all those things were starting to come apart, in part because the capital needs were never fully addressed in the original legislation. There's no mechanism for recapitalizing, and that was never built into the bill. So one of the big differences between, say, later programs like in the 70s when we put our money into Section 8, if I own a Section 8 property, I can recapitalize after 20 years. If I own a public housing property, as the Housing Authority does, it's not so easy. And as you know, Jimmy, from being here, it's not easy at all. So I do think that we're now at a point where that program, that missing piece, is now come home, not just in New York, but all around the country. My older daughter works in the Cleveland Housing Authority, and they have several sites that have the same capitalization issues that we do. And what I think about the program is, this is a program that's very powerful when you put the money back in the building as a fundamental principle. This is a place in New York City, none of the families who live with us could live anywhere else. In this market, in this place, there's no other place for them to be, because the jump from where they are now in terms of rent into other is just impossible to make. I sort of believe if we can solve the capital issue, the program has another 40 years of life left. In many, many markets, especially today, the cost of real estate is far exceeding what people can afford, and public housing fills a really essential gap. So I guess my faith and hope is that we can continue the program if we can put the investment, get these properties to a good level. And I think families can continue to live there.
You talked about the history of public housing. And I remember when I was at NYCHA, we had a 75th anniversary, and I gave a lecture on public housing and how it evolved. You talked about the capitalization. One of my issues has always been, a concern has been that the politics of public housing, the politics of poverty. I've always felt that when public housing gets a bad rap, it gets a bad reputation, but it doesn't have a real effective political constituency. You have the old women of your households are relatively poor, and the issue would be just, I mean, how do you? We had public housing, and it was working families transition out of public housing over a period of time. It serves a different constituency, and again, that constituency, I think, has lack political clout. I mean, how do you see it that way, or do you see it differently?
No, I think I agree with you, actually, that we stood by ourselves as a program. And we're one of the few housing programs that had to sort of stand by itself. I admit we're the oldest, and we come with some of the baggage of all the choices that were made in those earlier generations of the program. So the way I think about the capital is, you're drawing in the capital, whether it's public money or private money, under the mission. And especially if it's private money, you have to demonstrate that you sort of control that investment in a good way, and that the investment serves the mission. Now, in that model, let's say the RAD model or a tax credit model, I know we're not doing tax credits here in New York the same way, but you have partners, and suddenly the housing becomes important. Not that it shouldn't have been important on its own to begin with, but when you linking up, now someone's saying, well, wait a minute, we have public housing and we're invested in public housing in New York. So I am now concerned about this issue, Mr. or Mrs. Politician. That's another voice. And you add that voice on top of the resident voice and our voice, and you sort of have this coalition effect of the investment that I think would strengthen the program over time, because it's not just us arguing as an administrator, as a public agency, that we need the money or we need to do something differently. So we haven't broadened our net. I mean, I think I realize there's a lot of folks that aren't interested in putting private capital in public assets, and I understand their concern about it. but I feel like when I look around at the programs, they just have more people who are saying this program's of a concern and interest to me than just the agency that runs the real estate. And I think that's a help.
Good morning, Greg.
Good morning.
I'd like to ask you about the article that was in the Times in August of this year. On August 5th, Michael Kimmelman wrote an article titled "A Rebirth in the Bronx. Is this how to save public housing?" In that article, he touted the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, or the RAD program, which you mentioned, as a way to save public housing. Now, of course, there's no one way to save public housing, but give us your assessment of RAD and how it's helping to sustain New York City's and the nation's public housing stock.
RAD came out of a time when it was an Obama era program. It's a very smart way to think about the money you get. It combines the operating subsidy plus the capital money. In our model here, these transactions, these real estate transactions, take on a private partner. We have a development team come in. Now they can include nonprofits, and many do. The alarm that has been raised about RAD is, I think, is misplaced. If you look at a lot of the press on RAD, it's about displacement and privatization and loss of housing. That has not occurred to anywhere near the scale. If you just read about it, you'd think there were thousands. We're not even at a point in that discussion. But to the advocates who are against RAD and who are against private investment, they've done a very effective job of scaring the pants off of everybody. We want the additional money that RAD can bring in, either in the form of equity or other kinds of investment. And we want all the public housing rights that residents have, so there's no diminishment because of the investment. And a lot of the things I think we're used to seeing with, especially with low income or poor families, is, and in New York, I guess, there's a neighborhood, somebody sweeps in and suddenly it's gentrified and all those other families are no longer there. And that has happened in New York, of course. But with RAD, we're not saying that. With RAD, we're saying, look, yes, there's private capital, but we're keeping substantially the same protections you had as a public housing resident. We're adding the income, both in terms of capital investment and operating subsidy that RAD brings with it. And that's not a displacement program, that's in place investment. So I think RAD is a really useful tool. I know that a lot of folks don't believe us. A lot of folks feel like, well, you're setting us up with this RAD deal, this private entity, and in a few years we're going to be out and someone higher income is going to be in. That literally cannot happen. The ground lease that we use in this deal is a 99-year lease. It's a control document. You can't do anything with that property without NYCHA's approval, and you certainly couldn't disinvest yourself from it. So I like the program. It generates significant income. We're going to continue to close, I hope, a couple more deals this month. We hope to issue some requests for expression of interest early next year. We're on track to begin to touch 30,000 units in another year or so with RAD, which is about half of our goal. So it's really important because it recapitalizes without displacement.
Thank you. And I do have a question, but before that, I have to say that New York City is very expensive, and you're right about saying that there are a lot of working class that are working really hard, and without you and NYCHA fighting for their housing, implementing this RAD to better their lives and fixing the units, especially in the where it's mostly damaged, I think that many residents in New York City will have to either relocate because there's no other way that they can afford to live in New York, even as they are working class. So I do commend all the things that you said that NYCHA is doing and all the things that I've read about the RAD program, and in your case, the PAC program, is so significant to changing so many lives. So just wanted to say that we really do enjoy knowing about that. Talk to us about the PAC program that is designed to convert the 62,000 units to RAD. Now, for our listeners that are new, please explain to them what the PAC is so they don't.
Sure. PACT is our name for a series of investment options, including the rental assistance demonstration, the program we've just been talking about. RAD is part of that. But the other parts of the program include where we can try it using our capacity as because we have a lot of land to provide for the building of new housing that our residents could access. And the other thing that's included in PACT is transfers of development rights, likely in a neighborhood where there's activity, and we transfer some of our development right capacity, and we get paid for that, and we can put that money back into the property.
So then it's safe to assume that the 180 units that is under NYCHA right now, you are going to try to incorporate the PACT and the RAD program for that conversion.
Well,
correct?
they're targeted to 62,000 of our portfolio.
Okay.
Yeah, the full portfolio is not targeted for RAD or PACT. We proposed last year 110,000 units go through the Public Housing Preservation Trust, which is this project basing Section 8 model that we've been talking about, where we gained a new voucher and put that right into the property and do that kind of project basing. So that was the idea with the trust.
As you know, NYCHA's received a lot of criticism in the past for failure to provide basic services such as heat and hot water. I'm sure these were a lot of the complaints that led to the tripartite agreement between the Southern District, HUD, and NYCHA. How do you feel you're positioned at this point with winter coming?
So we've made huge investments in the maintenance and preventive maintenance programs. I would never represent that. I think every single part and every single boiler is done, but we've spent a lot of time on this. We have outages. Their duration and is not nearly as long as our worst winter, which was about 4 or 5 years ago, when we have system-wide outages that were quite severe. We do have new systems in place in some places where the agreement requires us to rebuild boilers. We have state and city money for that. We have some HUD money for that as well. We're installing new building management systems, although these are intended to sort of even out the heat. I'd say we're in better shape. We're stronger. I'm not going to represent that we've got it fixed, because I go in a boiler room and the boiler is as old as I am, or the mechanical technology. We have these are historic technologies now, and we're still using them. And that it's, I know it sounds, we have to build our own parts. We have a machine shop that builds pieces that are no longer in production. Tremendous amount of overhead. If I had that money, you could repurpose that money into things like basic services for janitorial and security. But in fact, we have old systems to maintain, both for elevators and heat and hot water. And we won't get past some of the mechanical issues. We have a lot of boilers go down for ancillary equipment, like a feed water pump or valve fails. And that steam engine technology has to be replaced with a different kind. So I think we're in a decent spot. I think we've made significant investments. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars more on the compliance departments, which lead, mold, asbestos, heat, elevators. We've increased the staffing in those areas over time, but we have a lot of work to do. There's no question that we've made good steps, but we don't consider us we're not at home yet. So.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And, just tell us, a bit about in the next, 3 or 4 years or in the next few months coming, what do you see is some of the, biggest accomplishments that you hope to achieve for NYCHA? And maybe we can start wrapping up with that.
Sure. Well, on the organizational level, we have reorganized the borough management structure pretty significantly. And we're coming down into that structure, like I talked about earlier. We're coming down to kind of a combination of neighborhood and property. And of course, these are large neighborhoods. These are 6,000, 7,000 units. But now we can start to build solutions at those levels and think about restructuring NYCHA using the property as the center point, as the focus. I think that's going to take some time, I think, but launching that and getting that in place, I would consider to be sort of a foundation stone accomplishment. We've got the foundation laid, there's more to build, but at least we've got that in place. And
More, yeah.
Yeah, and there's more to come there. That would be a major accomplishment, sort of launching the ship and getting it out to sea in a different way. And the second area would be reforming. We're going to reform our capital approach. We're going to try and, if among the various funding options we talked about, we want to do comprehensive modernization. We get money now. Oh, you're funded for the heating system. Well, I needed to be funded for the heating system. I needed to be funded for the elevators and all the pipes in the wall. So it's great
and all
that we
the
got
abatements.
yes, and all the abatement, which is quite extensive. I mean, so this comprehensive approach to the buildings, if we can get the combination of funds that we've been talking about, we are starting this year at 2 sites, the preliminary planning for 2 comprehensive modernization, 1 property in Harlem and 1 on Staten Island. And that model, I hope we can stamp out going forward. Really strong project management, really focused on comprehensive work in all the systems in the building, so that if you walk in the building, there's not a piece missing. You haven't just replaced an old boiler, you've put a whole new technology in, maybe even apartment-based technologies, which are now becoming more and more attractive, like heat pumps and in-unit water heaters and things like that.
Yeah.
So launching that would be my second thing to look to do, is having the capital become what we do for the next 10 or 12 years. And that each year we're starting a new series of capital projects. And as I said, some of our sites need $500 million, and getting to that, starting that, getting that stood up would be something I would look for, in even bolder than what we've been doing these past few years, but coming up next. So
I think that's wonderful. The 3 of us, Peter, Jimmy, and myself, have all experienced RAD both, firsthand. Peter is a development consultant, has done multiple RAD projects. Jimmy has also overseen about $6 billion worth of RAD projects here in Connecticut and across the state. Myself, as a construction manager, has been on the other side managing the RAD projects in the Connecticut. And we all 3 do have a passion of seeing good things get done, and just seeing the residents' face when they see these improvements. Is such a rewarding feeling. So we are really excited to have you here today to share with us what New York State is doing with your program and everything that you're doing. Jimmy.
Yeah, I have to just reiterate what Dee said. You probably don't remember a while back when you were in Cambridge. I came to meet you.
Yeah, actually, I do. So I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, and I was putting together the New Haven's moving work.
Yeah.
You were way ahead, and you were so gracious. We came up. You gave us your whole staff, and we came back, and people thought I really knew what I was talking about. I was really an expert, but I was thinking I'm only repeating everything that Greg just told me. But
That's part of our job, though. We're supposed to share.
We put
Yeah.
together one heck of a MTW program in New Haven, as you're aware of, and so you've always been a leader in this industry. So what's next for you personally?
I think the next thing is I really want to shepherd what we're doing in a good way. I mean, I'm at the tail end of my career in a way of speaking. It was one of the reasons I felt I could take this job. I don't necessarily need to go to another job. Success or failure, I can still, be intact. I am not quite sure what the next thing is. We have a lot of things here I would really like to make sure come out of the incubator and into the actual investments that all three of you just so eloquently described. And when you bring capital, it brings other things with it. It brings people want to be a part of it. People want to invest in the family. People want to help you invest in the family. I think maybe that's what's next, is to make sure that those things happen in a good way here.
Awesome. I don't think I could have said a final word. This was beautiful. Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Greg. What you shared is actually very encouraging in looking at the future of not only NYCHA, but possibilities for public housing. So hopefully some of these opportunities that we discussed come to fruition and give you the tools that you clearly are already in position to use.
Peter, thank you. And Jimmy, it's good to see you, and good to meet you, V.
Same here.
Thanks for joining us and listening to today's episode of YIMBY Nation. Continue the conversation in your communities and on social using #YIMBY Nation. Connect with V at www.vaseconstruction.com. Connect with Jimmy at www.sincereconsulting.com. And connect with Peter by searching Collaborative Development Consulting on LinkedIn.com. Please leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform so we can continue helping communities thrive. Email us at contact@yimbynation.com or visit the podcast website at www.yimbynation.com. Until next time.